I'm the Reverend Dr. Sandana Gallman Ashley, and I have the privilege of serving as your transitional Synod leader. And we're very thankful to have you here for this important webinar today. Our guest presenter is Amanda Tyler. She is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty. She leads the organization as it upholds its historic Baptist principle of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion and protecting against its establishment by government. She is the lead organizer of the BJC's Christian Against Christian Nationalism campaign and co-host of the BJC's Respecting Religion podcast. She is the author of the new book, How to End Christian Nationalism, published by Broadleaf Books in October of 2024. Tyler is a constitutional law analyst. She advocates for faith freedom and it has been featured in news outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News, ABC News, CNN, MSNBC. She often preaches for congregations and resources denominations across the U.S. She's a member of the Texas and the U.S. Supreme Court Bar. She is experienced in working with Congress in a private legal practice and serving as a law clerk for a federal judge. She's originally from Austin, Texas, and holds degrees from the Edmund Wash School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and the University of Texas School of Law. We welcome to the Synod of the Northeast, Amanda Tyler, this morning, and let us welcome her to our midst. Thank you for being with us, Amanda.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be with you all and so pleased to know of your interest in this topic. So for this morning, I have planned a presentation that runs about 40 minutes, and then I'd love to engage in times of question and answer or conversation or reaction to that. So I am going to share my screen, just one moment, and start the slideshow. So hopefully you all can see that. I just wanted to start by giving a short explanation of the organization that I lead, which is Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. We go by BJC for short. You all might be learning about BJC for the first time today. And so just a little bit about our history. We are an 89-year-old advocacy and education organization. Our headquarters are on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., though our staff and our supporters go coast to coast. And in fact, although I was working out of the D.C. office for most of my tenure as executive director, for the past 2 years, I have lived and worked out of Dallas, Texas, which is where I'm joining you from today. And I do speak all over the country in person and many more and more virtually, just like I'm here today. So grateful for this opportunity. Our mission is to defend and extend religious freedom for all. And we bring a uniquely Baptist perspective to that topic, saying that for religion to be free, it must be free from government control, must not be advanced or prohibited or by the government. And so we stand for a strong separation of the institutions of church and state. And for most of our history, that work has been done in the halls of power in Washington. We file briefs, printed the court briefs to the U.S. Supreme Court in church-state cases. We advocate to Congress. We've led coalitions that have passed legislation such as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. We provide information and monitor what's happening at the executive branch. But several years ago, we started to recognize the growing threat of something that we and many others have come to call Christian nationalism. We realize that to truly achieve our vision for faith, freedom for all, that we needed to address this particular and pernicious ideology of Christian nationalism. So it was in 2019 that we formed an initiative called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We did so in the wake of deadly violence and houses of worship. When we think of particularly what happened at Mother Emanuel AME Church in 2015 with threats against houses of worship and synagogues in particular in Charlottesville in 2017, and then the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in 2018. And so a group of us, it started out actually as an interfaith group, but a group of us gathered and said, what can we do about it? And it was our interfaith colleagues and friends, our Jews and Muslims and people from the Sikh community that said to us, we agree with you that Christian nationalism is a growing threat, but we think, and they said this very kindly, we think Christians, this is your work to do. And so they really encouraged us to make this a Christian-led effort. And so from the beginning, it has been an ecumenical effort, including with strong partners from PCUSA. When we named the campaign Christians Against Christian Nationalism, we had in mind some of the words from James Baldwin. James Baldwin, who wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it is not faced." And we thought it was really important that we face head on the problem of Christian nationalism. And so when we started the campaign, we really just wanted to understand this better in order to be able to dismantle it. And so I'm going to start with some definitions. I start every conversation with definitions. I think it's really important that we have a common language and understanding about what we're talking about. Before we drill more deeply into Christian nationalism in the US context, I want to provide this definition of religious nationalism. It's a fusion of national and religious identities and goals, and it's a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today. I often say in Christian nationalism, I think can go back all the way to the time of Constantine, when the power of empire started appropriating Christianity on its own and using the force of empire, of power, in order to force Christianity onto other people. It might not have started out that way, but it quickly, in the hands of power, got into that position. And we can look around the world today and see other examples of religious nationalism. For instance, in Russia, with the Russian Orthodox Church, or in Hungary, in Israel, in India, in a number of African countries. Religious nationalism, in other words, is not a uniquely American problem, but in the US context, it does have unique dimensions because of US history. And so I want to get into a definition of Christian nationalism in the US context. I'll use QR codes at different points in the presentation, so you can go quickly to the website on Christians Against Christian Nationalism to get more information. But the way we define Christian nationalism is this: it's a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities into one. In other words, Christian nationalism suggests that to be a real American, that one has to be a Christian. And increasingly, not just any kind of Christian, but often a Christian who holds fundamentalist religious beliefs that are often in line with conservative political priorities. Now, just to hold fundamentalist religious beliefs or just to have conservative political priorities does not necessarily mean one is embracing Christian nationalism. But to believe that to be a real American, that one has to agree with you on those items, that indicates Christian nationalism might be present. So I also think when we're defining Christian nationalism, we also have to think about white Christian nationalism. And the way that we've talked about it in the project is this: that Christian nationalism often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. And that's because, again, in the US context, Christian nationalism both creates and perpetuates a sense of cultural belonging that's limited to those people who held power when the country was formed. And in our initial founding documents, the people who held full power, who held full rights of citizenship, was a really narrow group of people. It was white, mostly Protestant, Christian men who owned property. That's a very narrow circle of belonging that leaves a lot of people out. And Christian nationalism, which we'll get into in a bit more detail, with its assumptions that this is the way that God created the United States, that there was a particular divine plan in mind, continues to perpetuate the sense of cultural belonging that's really limited to that same narrow group of people. The Christian in white Christian nationalism is less about a given theology or even a set of religious beliefs or doctrines, and more about an ethno-national identity, an ethno-national identity of whiteness. And we can look to US history for other examples of white Christian nationalism. And one particularly clear one is the KKK. You know, 100 years ago, the KKK was not a fringe organization as it thankfully is now. It was then a very mainstream organization. Millions of Americans were members of the KKK. And it is a very graphic example of this toxic mix of white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and violence that was directed not just against African Americans, but also Catholic Americans and Jewish Americans, that again tried to draw the circle of belonging so tight, and that ended, of course, in lynching and in other violence that was directed against communities that, from their perception and their distortion of the gospel, said did not belong in the United States. So some of the markers of Christian nationalism, one is this heavy reliance on a mythological history of the United States as a quote unquote Christian nation. This is something we hear a lot, right? America is a Christian nation. Well, when people say that, they really aren't usually suggesting that America is a majority Christian nation. I mean, that's true, right? A majority of Americans, although the number is declining pretty steadily, but a majority of Americans continue to claim a Christian identity of one sort or another. But that's not what they're talking about. Instead, they are often suggesting that America was founded by Christians in order to promote and privilege Christianity in law and policy. Some of the markers, this can go in a lot of different directions. One of them is this heavy emphasis on God's providential hand guiding the United States through our history and even into our present politics. Some of the more extreme ideas, or even the founding documents themselves, were divinely inspired. It's a cherry-picked history of the United States that really overemphasizes the religious biographies of certain founders, while conveniently ignoring the other founders who had not so orthodox Christian beliefs. Really, the issue here is that many of the people who were a part of the founding of the country, many of them did claim a Christian identity. Many of them did have Christian beliefs. But in setting up the country, they did something very different. And the constitutional history and the constitutional text tells us so, that far from creating a Christian nation, they actually made a very bold move to disestablish religion from government control. At the time of the founding, many of the colonies did have established religion, an official government religion, that taxes collected would go to support the established religion. And those who were out of step with that established religion were persecuted or fined or otherwise ostracized to different extents. Baptists were certainly among those dissenters. Presbyterians were among those dissenters, although they did so in a much more orderly way than the renegade Baptists often would do. But they all were outside of government control. And so people like Presbyterians and Baptists and others had concerns about this. And these issues were debated at the Constitutional Congress. And so my favorite rejoinder or response to people who are making the argument that America is a Christian nation is actually go to the text of the Constitution itself. If we were a Christian nation, you'd expect to find, if the founders indeed intended to create a Christian nation, you'd expect it to find some textual support. I'm an attorney, so I kind of, go to the text. Well, there's no mention of Christianity in the US Constitution. There's no mention of God or of any other deity in the US Constitution. And in fact, the only mention of religion in the original Constitution is in Article 6, which prohibits religious tests for public office. And so if indeed the founders were trying to set up a Christian nation, not only did they not mention it, but they actually set it up in the most ineffective way possible by banning religious tests for public office. This wasn't an accident of history. This was something that was actively debated at the time. And it was a choice that they made, a choice to separate one's religious identity from one's citizenship or belonging. And indeed, one of the highest forms of citizenship is to hold public office. And so if those people who are elected, if they did not have to have a certain religious identity to hold office, I think this is a great response or argument to rebut this persistent myth that America is a Christian nation, because it is not in the way that is often meant to that what they're meaning or trying to do in this case. So in addition to talking about markers of Christian nationalism, I want to talk about what Christian nationalism is and what it is not, and to offer some comparison. And so I want to talk first about how Christian nationalism departs from Christianity. Pure and simple Christian nationalism is a form of idolatry. And that's because it seeks to merge religious and political identities into one, and political and religious authority into one. And this is a direct contradiction of the gospel. One of the many teachings of Jesus in the Gospels was when some people came to him, again, trying to trap him, according to the Gospels, and they asked a question: is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? And Jesus, as he often did not directly answer their question, but instead asked them to reason and think with him. And he said, well, someone who has a coin, someone bring me a coin. And he holds up the head of the coin and says, whose head is on this coin? And they say, Caesar's. And then the teaching is, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Implicit in this teaching is that God is not Caesar and Caesar is not God, that these are distinct realms of authority. And that continues to be true today as much as it was then. But Christian nationalism tells us in other ways that God and Caesar are one, that there is this work together, that there is some divine calling of certain leaders to effect God's will on earth. And that just simply isn't in line with Jesus's teaching on this particular topic. But if we look more broadly in the Gospels, if we think about the work that Jesus was about, Jesus was always on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed. Jesus talked about releasing the captives. Jesus was working with those who were oppressed by power, not the powerful. And if I had to sum up all of the Gospels in one word, I would use the word love. Because, of course, Jesus taught us of all the commandments, we are to love God, and that we show our love for God by loving our neighbor. If I had to sum up Christian nationalism in one word, it would be about power. And so Christian nationalism replaces the gospel of love with this false idol of power. The problem is, of course, that Christian nationalism uses the language and the symbols of Christianity And so to a casual observer, and maybe even to some of us sometimes, it can look and feel like the same thing. And we have to acknowledge that because of a long history of Christian nationalism, I said at the beginning, I think we can go all the way back to Constantine. We have centuries of Christian nationalism labeled one on top of each other. In the US context, because of the influence of European Christianity in this country, we have centuries of different Christians sacrificing their gospel of love to a false idol of power. We can look back to the doctrine of discovery, for instance, which was this heresy that it was God's will for European conquerors to steal native land and to enslave people when they got here. They distorted the gospel to try to make a religious case for conquest. We saw the same thing with the Bible being used and distorted and taken out of context to try to justify chattel slavery in the United States. So we have, all this sediment of Christian nationalism that is built up over so many centuries. And so it's up to us, modern day Christians living in the US, to try to excavate that, to dig through all those layers of sediment, to understand where have we just inherited a religion that looks more like Christian nationalism than it does the teachings of Jesus. That's the deep work that I think religious communities, Christian communities are called to do in this moment. We'll talk later about some of the evidence of Christian nationalism in our society more broadly, but this work very much starts in our congregations, in our own lives as discipleship, and how we approach following Jesus in this moment. Now, just like the people that Jesus was teaching way back in his time, we are citizens of two kingdoms, right? We are, both living our lives for Jesus and for God, and we are living in the United States. And so when we think about these dual identities, I also want to talk about the difference between Christian nationalism and patriotism. Again, some simple definitions. Patriotism, a love of country. And like all other kinds of love, in order for it to be authentic, it has to be freely chosen. It can't be forced on us. We don't have to be patriotic. And because of a lot of different complicated histories and different perspectives and identities, it is a rational choice for people not to feel a great sense of patriotism or love of country for our country. But for those of us who do feel a love of country, there's so many different ways that we can express it. They can be symbolic, like waving an American flag or saying the Pledge of Allegiance. They can also be expressive, like exercising our First Amendment rights by choosing not to say the Pledge of Allegiance, by engaging in different kinds of protest. We can love our country enough to want better for it. And so there's no one way to express patriotism. Nationalism, on the other hand, is an allegiance to country that demands supremacy over all of their allegiances, including for those of us who are Christians, to Jesus. And so a question that I often ask people to ask ourselves or to pose to others in appropriate situations is my sense of patriotism causing me to violate some core religious conviction? Am I being put to the choice of these two things? If so, then I would suggest it is not a healthy love of country. It has ventured into this unhealthy territory of nationalism. And that we need to be clear about the difference between those two. In fact, my advocacy to try to dismantle Christian nationalism is both born out of my commitment as a Christian. In all of ways, I see it as a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus, and also as my status as a patriotic American, in my belief in the First Amendment, in the rights that everyone has to have freedom of religion in this country, and my deep conviction that Christian nationalism, it violates those ideals of religious freedom. And so I think as we move forward, that we should not feel that we have to abandon a sense of patriotism, if we have one, in order to engage in these conversations. by this point, you might be like, well, how prevalent is this idea really? And this is something that social scientists have been studying more closely over the last several years. And one of those studies is put out by the Public Religion Research Institute, which goes by PRRI. They're based in Washington, D.C., and they have done several large studies that have asked Americans posed these statements to Americans and asked them how much they agree or disagree with these statements. That the U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. And God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. You'll notice that these statements mirror quite a bit those markers of Christian nationalism that I put forward earlier. And so then based on people's responses, the researchers plot them along a spectrum of Christian nationalism. Now, before I dive more deeply here, I want to explain that Christian nationalism is not something you have or you don't have. It's not a box that you check. It's not an immutable characteristic. It is rather a spectrum that each and every one of us has an opportunity every day to either embrace or reject Christian nationalism or be somewhere in the middle. And so for that reason, it is my practice, and you may have picked up on it by now, but I don't label anyone a Christian nationalist. I don't think that's very helpful to the conversation. I think that when people are labeled as something, it makes it, again, seem like an immutable characteristic and not something they have any power over it to change, or as if I'm labeling them or name calling. That's not the point of this at all. It's also, as the science shows us, social science shows us, it's not accurate because it's not, again, something that someone either has or it doesn't. Now, those who strongly agreed with all those statements I just put up, the researchers say that put them in a category of adherents to Christian nationalism. And people who strongly disagree with all those statements are put in the category of rejectors of Christian nationalism. And then somewhere in the middle, you're either skeptical or sympathetic to it. And then there are 4% that they just didn't have enough data, or they just said, I don't know, so that's kind of obviously a small statistical minority. But for those that they could plot somewhere on this graph, I think a few things to note. One, the smallest group by far are the adherents to Christian nationalism. I think this should be a reassuring word to all of us. At the same time, if you were to extrapolate these across the entire US population, 10% of the US population, that's a lot of people. So, it kind of goes both ways. But I'm encouraged to know that there are 3 times as many people who reject Christian nationalism as those who adhere to it. And in fact, when you put the rejectors and skeptics together versus the sympathizers and adherents, it's 2 to 1, people moving away than people moving toward. This is often not the narrative that we receive, right? We often receive this idea that a majority of Americans are somehow adopting these ideas of Christian nationalism. And that's just not the case. And on the next map, you might be thinking, okay, well, what about nationally? What does this look like? So this is a map. So this is specifically looking among white Americans. Okay, so not even the whole population as a whole, but among white Americans, when you look at those who are adhering or sympathetic to Christian nationalism. Again, the national average is 30%. So if the states that are shaded in some shade of blue are over the national average, and the states that are shaded in some hue of green are under the national average. Now you can see for the Northeast, all the states are under the national average. These are also statewide numbers. So you can imagine a lot of geographic diversity within any of these states, so that there might be pockets that are higher, pockets that are lower than even the state average. But I want to kind of center in on my state of Texas, right? 37% of white Americans are either adhering or sympathetic to Christian nationalism. A high number, but still a minority. And when I saw these numbers, I was a little surprised, because when you look at the state policies in Texas, some of the policies coming out of Texas are the most extreme versions of Christian nationalism anywhere in the country. And so even in a conservative state like Texas, there is a minority of people are actually adhering to these ideas or even sympathetic to them. And I think this signals that those who do adhere to Christian nationalism are holding a disproportionate amount of political power and using that political power to pursue policies that the majority of people in their jurisdictions do not agree with, right? That are out of step with what the norm is there. And this could get us into a whole other conversation about political gerrymandering and how the extremes of either party are holding a disproportionate amount of power because of their ability to choose their own constituents. But I think that this map kind of helps us understand both that Christian nationalism is an issue everywhere, but that there are certain areas that are certainly more heavily influenced by it. Part of what we are trying to do at Christians Against Christian Nationalism is also help people better understand the difference between Christian nationalism and faith-based advocacy. The goal, as we just try to work to dismantle Christian nationalism, it is not to take faith or people of faith out of the public square. Far from it. In fact, at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, one of our unifying principles is that people of all faith and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. We have a lot of examples of people not engaging constructively in the public square. And January 6, 2021 is an extreme example of that, where people took to the Capitol trying to overturn the results of the election and then resulted to mob violence in order to try to achieve their goals. The picture on the left here was also taken on January 6th, but on January 6, 2023, 2 years after the attack on the Capitol. And a group of us gathered at dawn across from the Capitol to bear witness to the role that Christian nationalism played in the attack on the Capitol. Between these two pictures, of course, a lot happened, and among that was the work of the January 6th Select Committee on Capitol Hill. And that select committee solicited testimony from me and from other leaders about Christian nationalism. And it came after Baptist Joint Committee, working with Freedom from Religion Foundation, put out a report detailing a lot of examples of Christian nationalism from January 6th. And so a number of us provided testimony, and then we eagerly awaited the report from the January 6th Select Committee. It was, as you might recall, it was like a 1,000-page report. No mention of Christian nationalism in their 1,000 pages of report. It was deeply disturbing to us because it was an intentional omission. And the omission became, I believe, because of these elected leaders feeling that they would take a political hit if they called out Christian nationalism. They feared that they would falsely be accused of attacking Christianity. And so at that point, a group of religious leaders, we felt it was our responsibility to be the ones to say, we are Christians and we are standing against Christian nationalism. We are willing to call out what Christian nationalism is. Sometimes our elected leaders are elected to represent us. Again, we could have a much longer conversation about whether that's really happening in a number of different places. But in order to represent us, we need to make our views known. And so the idea of advocacy, speaking from our faith-based positions about our concerns, not just about Christian nationalism, but about other issues that impact our communities, we should feel free to do that. What we need to be wary of is, as we speak from our faith, not insisting that our particular views, our religious views, be reflected in law and policy. That would cross the line back into Christian nationalism. And so as we advocate from our faith-based perspectives, we need to be mindful of that particular distinction. We also, earlier I encouraged us that we really need to be attentive to Christian nationalism in the ways that we practice our faith as well. And so some of this is really looking very intently about our worship services, our liturgies, messages that are coming through sermons, the hymns that we sing, the symbols that we might have in our sacred spaces. One such symbol that is present in many churches is an American flag. And so my question is often for not to say to congregations, take that flag out of the sanctuary, but rather have a conversation with your congregation about why is this flag in the sanctuary? What symbol, what are we trying to send? Where is it? If it's on the altar, is it sending a signal that we are somehow worshiping or aligning our religious views with our political position as American citizens? If it's placed somehow, near the chancel, like there are lots of, and many people know, U.S. flag, there's a whole set of regulations about how high it needs to be compared to other flags. If we're following that and we're putting it above, for instance, a Christian flag, what are we saying about what prominence our national identity has above our faith? Shouldn't our faith be the most important piece of our identity everywhere we live, but certainly in our religious spaces? And so these are kind of the questions and the interrogation that I think is really important for congregations to be able to have. Once we've dealt with things in our own house, quite literally, then we can turn our attention with more integrity and more resolve and with more unity into our public spaces. And wherever we are, we have public schools in our midst. And public schools have been one of the principal targets for those who are trying to perpetuate Christian nationalism in law and policy. Here are just a few examples of how Christian nationalism is pushed in public policy today. Teaching of this Christian nation mythology in place of a more honest history. Efforts, for instance, to teach a version of history that cherry picks and suggests that the founders were religious people trying to push religion into law and policy, while not teaching about the separation of church and state, not teaching about the constitutional text that actually protects religious freedom by keeping government neutral when it comes to religion. A lot of these bills often say explicitly, or their proponents will say, well, we're just trying to return Judeo-Christian values to our public schools. My ears perk up when I hear Judeo-Christian because it is often used as a way to signal a kind of inclusivity while it is actually perpetuating Christian nationalism. And that's because, quite simply, there is no such thing as a Judeo-Christian religion, right? There is Christianity and there is Judaism. And to use Judeo as a modifier of Christianity actually is quite offensive to Judaism as an independent religion. In practice, when things are labeled Judeo-Christian values, what they really are is some form of Christianity, maybe something taken from the Hebrew Bible, but through a Christian lens. So even though our two religions may share the same scriptures, the interpretation and understanding of them is very different in many cases. And to suggest otherwise, again, is dismissive of Judaism. It could even be, in some examples, a form of anti-Semitism or perpetuating anti-Semitic tropes, and something to be very careful of. Of course, even if we took it at face value, Judeo-Christian does not include Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, atheist or agnostic. There are many other people who are living in our culture, whose children are going to school, whose children who hold these views, who continue to be excluded if we are just focusing even on Jewish or Christian values. That this rationale has been used most recently to say that we need to have the posting of "In God We Trust" or the Ten Commandments in public schools, the teaching of Bible in the curriculum, not in an objective way, one that promotes just cultural literacy, but rather in a more devotional way, in a way that would try that where the use of the Bible looks more like a Christian Sunday school than it does a public school. We see it with content bans and book bans. And then in some cases, even in promoting the use of school chaplains in schools instead of mental health counselors. So this was an idea that first came out of the state of Texas. The original version of the bill in Texas, there may be some people here on the call who are professional chaplains. So you would be very interested in this. The definition of chaplain in the Texas bill is anyone who can pass a criminal background check. So no special training, licensure, special clinical training, and experience, not even an ability to work with children. And then as far as defining what the chaplain, no definition of what the chaplain would do or say. And in Texas, there was even an amendment put forward to require parental consent before someone could meet with a school chaplain, and they rejected that as well. Now, the fortunate thing, this bill passed, and instead of just automatically requiring the hiring of chaplains in schools, it went to school boards to decide whether or not they wanted to adopt the policy. And the vast majority of school boards in Texas rejected it. And again, I think I go back to that map, right? That even though this very extreme policy passes from the state legislature, the majority of Texans are know better. The majority of Texans are concerned about what kind of division this would bring, how this would harm religious freedom, including the religious freedom of Christians. And so they rejected it. And so I think that is an encouraging story and can often be a blueprint for how other places, if some of these policies come, how people on the ground can make their views known, and that local officials can reject things even if the state officials might pass them. So as I wind up my presentation, eager to have conversation with you all, what can we do to push back against Christian nationalism? I refer again to our initiative, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We are trying and encourage you to sign up there. You can sign a statement to show that you agree with these principles, but there are other ways just to get our alerts, where we will send mobilization, action alerts if there are things that are happening either nationally or in your particular area. This question, what can I do, is why I wrote this book, How to End Christian Nationalism. It's the question that I got the most. And so I really try to break down in the book through 8 steps that can be read individually, but even better in group study, for people to really understand, what is my piece to play? The problem of Christian nationalism is so big that we can fall into a place of despair, of just not feeling like that it's too big for any one of us to do. And the truth it is too big for any one of us to do. But doing this work in community, we actually can each have a piece of, it will be slow, it will be hard work, but we can work to dismantle this poisonous ideology. And one of those ways that we're really trying to encourage people to do it is to organize locally. And so this QR code takes you to our local groups page on the Christians Against Christian Nationalism website. I was looking, there is a local group forming in New Brunswick, New Jersey. I think that's the only place in your Synod area so far that is formed, but would love to see additional groups formed. What our staff does is really try to resource. We can provide some consultation, one-on-one training. This is all free of charge. Consultation, one-on-one training. We have some peer learning groups where people are sharing ideas. We have a lot of resources. But these are just opportunities for people to gather who really do want to be involved in the long haul and really work to understand and what the harms to your local community, and work together to fashion in a faith-based organizing space what some responses and interventions might be to the work. So would encourage anyone who's interested to go to this QR code and follow up with us there. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And now I can actually see you all again. And I guess I'll hand it back over for how we're going to facilitate the next piece.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda, and for the information. We certainly appreciate all that you shared, and I learned a lot this morning. I do want to give some opportunity for questions, and so we're going to ask that you would raise your electronic hand if you have questions today for Amanda. So it looks like Dr. Earl Johnson. You're muted.
Just wanted to share the Presbytery of Albany in Albany, New York, passed a declaration on May 1st entitled, we cannot remain silent. And it started out as a study of the Barmen Declaration. And we see some very close connections between the two, and also studies of the idea of leader, or more directly, Führer. And our confession of 1967 said, we will not accept any leader other than Jesus Christ as our primary focus. And that can be found just by going to Albany Presbytery website. And it was written partly for study of congregations as well as individuals.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you. The next person we have, I see Diane.
No.
Thank you. In my church, we read, in our book group, we read your book. And we read it along with this extraordinary article that came out in the Atlantic in February by Stephanie McCrummen about the New Apostolic Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm sure you're familiar with it. So I have two comments. One is I appreciated you giving the rejoinder to those who say that our country was founded by Christians as a Christian nation, because when the Pilgrims came over, that was true. No, that was true. When the Mayflower came over,
right,
that was true. But the inflection point was the forming of the United States. You made this point, the United States of America and the Constitution, and that's where it was a deliberate change. So I appreciated having that to give as a rejoinder. But the other comment I wanted to make is, in our book group, when we were talking about your ideas in juxtaposition with this New Apostolic Reformation, in that article, there's a political scientist at Denison University who's doing some new surveys that seem to update the data from PRRI, and that seem to suggest that a much larger percentage, not of Americans, but of Americans who identify as Christian adhere to these principles that you were talking about. So I'm just throwing that out there, that I to the extent that you continue to publish, I would love to see some further work on that based on this emerging data. Thank you.
Yeah. Appreciate that very much. And I'll say, I'm going to look up that study. And the people at PRI, particularly Robbie Jones, has also said, because there is this myth out there, and it would be convenient if it were true for us to say, oh, the people who are pushing, they're not really Christian, right? And the fact is that a lot of them are Christian. They do claim a Christian identity. Now we can say they aren't following the teachings of Jesus. It's a distortion of the gospel. I think all of that is very true. But what about this has so infected the various manifestations of American Christianity that it has taken a hold in these really extreme ways? So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's Kate next and then Maria.
My question is around civil religion. And while it is very true that our documents do not hold to a specific religious identity, our practice as Americans, going back to the very beginning, is not consistent. Western culture, our ability to believe and practice in different ways and the question that I have is, does that suggest that that civil religion is on a continuum and Christian nationalism is its extreme? Or do you see civil religion, the practice of, chaplains in the Synod and in the House and historically days of prayer established by the Congress, or Thanksgiving as a national holiday? Are those all a different animal or simply on a continuum?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I appreciate the examples, because I think about there are kind of a couple of different categories of civil religion. I mean, one of them are just kind of these examples of, I'll just call it like generic religious references, often pretty generic, like that try, and in God we trust, one might even kind of put into that category, although that's a kind of put that aside as a more modern example of Christian nationalism. And then at the same time, other pieces that make almost a religion out of our patriotism are American documents or American, just to be an American, and kind of just like that becomes almost a religion in and of itself. So those are, I think, kind of two different sides of the same issue. I view it, and we have to think about it in context too. The percentage of people who held power, again, because I don't think we have very good demographic data, for instance, on the enslaved population of early American history, when we do know anecdotally that a large number were Muslim, right? But people never talk about that, or the indigenous populations, right? So there are lots of people who aren't really counted and literally were not counted in census documents or in to kind of take an account of what their religion was. But if you think about the people who were considered citizens, a larger percentage of them back in the founding period claimed a Christian identity than does today. And so just like in all kinds of political discourse, you're going to use references that your audience hears, right? And Stephen K. Green, he is a constitutional historian. He has done great work on this. He's written a book called The Founding. I'm now going to mess it up. It's in my bibliography of my book, but basically the founding of a Christian nation, or just this idea, that's not the exact right title, but it's about kind of looking at the difference exactly of what you're saying between civil religion and what the constitutional order actually said. And I think that there can be a lot of confusion between the two, because people will reference these examples of civil religion to justify laws that would actually try to establish religion in different ways. And so I don't think that civil religion is harmless for that very reason. And I think that when we repeat some of these things, we need to be cognizant of the message that they're sending. And the question for us should, I believe, and I say this as a lawyer, I don't often think the right question is even, is it constitutional? I think does this promote what I believe is the founding ideal that everyone belongs in the country, regardless of religion or religious identity, right? Does it promote that? And if it doesn't, then maybe we shouldn't be the ones to keep repeating those vestiges of civil religion. God bless America. Almost every politician will close their speech with that. What signal is that sending when we continue to repeat these vestiges of civil religion? Is it unconstitutional? No, but does it promote a sense of both belonging, and does it honor our religion as a distinct piece of what it means for our political citizenship?
Thank you. We want to get as many questions in. I see Maria and then another hand. It says Liz. I'm not sure if that's correct or not. So Maria, then Liz.
Always the project, how to unmute. I every time I hear you give an answer, it's like, oh, part of my thing got answered. But I think the thing that concerns me is, who are these people behind this? There's a lot of money that's being expended to lobby in the federal houses. There's a lot of money expended in advertising. And I'm beginning to get the sense that Christian nationalism is being supported by a lot of people who aren't really even Christian, but are using this whole system to obtain power from themselves. I mean, we have Cheeto Jesus out there doing his thing. So how do we counter that verbally? I mean, Amanda, my family is from Lubbock, Texas. So you have a pretty good idea of the kind of arguments I get from family up there, highly conservative, probably fall definitely in the supporters of Christian nationalism. It's very difficult for me because I get discounted then. If I try and use Christian language, talk about what I see as what Christ wanted us to do, they just totally discount it. And, are like, you're a heretic, you're not really Christian. The other one, of course, is, well, you live in the North, which is another discounting argument for them. So what language as Christians can we use that will counter those things without allowing them then to grab it back from us?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will, before I get to that, I do want to answer your question about who's behind it, and it's not one person, but it is, I've come to think about Christian nationalism as both this political ideology, but also a well-funded movement that has many different pieces and parts. And I will say that's not my particular area of expertise, but there are people who've written, and most recently, Catherine Stewart has written a book, and I'm going to look, it's behind me. It's called Money, Lies, and God. And she's done a lot of work on kind of understanding the funding sources and the different players behind the Christian nationalism movement. Here in Texas, there's been a lot of reporting behind just a few billionaires who have bankrolled a lot of the work here in Texas. And these are people who attend the churches and who ascribe very closely to the Christian nationalism beliefs. And so I do think that a lot of the money that is being pushed is both for power, but also because they believe that it is God's will for Christians who hold their views to take over government, education, entertainment, business, every sector of American life. And that's what's motivating them. How to talk to people about this. It is a question I get a lot. I feel the pain that often comes with that question, or a sense of alienation or broken relationship, certainly views being discounted. And so I think it is not always, I talk about this in my book. There is a chapter on it. I rely heavily on others who have written from a psychological standpoint on how to do this work. But I think if we approach our relationships with a genuine sense, I'm not saying this is easy, okay, but with a genuine sense of curiosity about what's behind some of these beliefs, and open up our own sense of vulnerability or examples of where we may have changed our mind or gotten off track or not been fully living into our understanding the gospel, that there may be space. Now, this is not a one conversation. I think it is a conversation. It's not something done through texts or definitely not on social media, but in something that's done in real relationship. And it's done not to try to change someone's mind, and maybe not even to be understood ourselves, but to seek a greater understanding of the person that we're talking to. I think there are times and places for that. And I don't think that's the only way that we can work to dismantle it, is to go to those in our circles who have most embraced it and try to convert them out of it, because that will likely not work. That's why I think kind of finding others in your network that you can work together with, and actually do the longer term organizing or the advocacy work, that putting our efforts into those can be often more impactful than trying to change people's minds about it, and to think that over time, that there will be some change or growth there, and by watching what you're doing in the public square. So I appreciate, those are just some of my thoughts on that hard question.
Thank you. So we have Liz and then Jim.
Thanks so much. And Amanda, thank you for your work. I'm so grateful. I'm an Episcopal priest and a queer theologian. And so I spend a lot of time talking with folks about issues around human sexuality. And I hear back from folks, particularly in mainline congregations, a lot, this concern that we have ceded the theological turf to folks who are promoting this very conservative, and many people think false, I think false and toxic form of Christianity. And you've really laid out beautifully here exactly the ways that the alignment with power, political power, leads to a distorted gospel. So when I'm talking with folks very often who have this concern, like they start because they're worried about how the gospel has been distorted around human sexuality, but increasingly what I'm hearing back is it's not just about that. It's about, caring for the stranger in our midst. It's about immigration. It's about, it's all these issues now that, the sort of the hydra-headed monster of white Christian nationalism. And increasingly people are saying to me, what should we be doing? What should we be saying in the public square? So I've been trying to do some of what you're talking about, like bringing people together, doing some local organizing in order to create a different kind of public witness, a Christian witness, less like a politically aligned effort, but more, we want to make visible what Christianity actually is supposed to be. And I just wonder, if you could deploy an effort like that, like what would you have us saying and doing? What do you think are the important things when we gather together we should be out there saying, doing, trying to make visible in the world?
Yeah, great question. And I think great instinct to do that work. And I'll say, I would encourage, if you're interested, to get in touch with our team. Joy Pettigrew is the one who really works one-on-one and in small groups with leaders like yourself, and just trying to both share ideas about what to do, resources. Maybe she's talked to others in other communities and can say, this is something that works. I think really what I love there is the authenticity of understanding, like speaking to, this is how I understand my faith. This is how I interpret the Bible. This is how I'm convicted to live this way, and to divorce it completely from any partisan agenda whatsoever. And I think that's implicit in everything I'm saying here, but there is no partisan agenda that should exactly match our religion. If it does, then our religion is not Christianity. It's whatever the party platform is of the group that's pushing it. And so to really, I think, kind of speak, and not to be like, when you're in the public square speaking to, this is what my faith calls me to do, you are speaking from a personal or a collective experience. You are not then saying, I want to pass a religious law that makes everybody else live according to this, but you're trying to better the community. And by protecting our immigrant neighbors, for instance, that's not a religious law. That is a law of inclusion that is informed and influenced by our faith, but isn't something that's limited to our faith, in the way that I would juxtapose, for instance, policies that try to, particularly around human sexuality, that try to enforce a particular reading of the Bible, and legislate that through, for instance, teaching about that there are only two immutable genders, and that's given to us in our religious text, and therefore we must ignore all science that would contradict this understanding, or other areas about even like defining when life begins. A lot of those bills define it by referencing scripture, which is a particular interpretation of scripture that not even all religions or even all Christians share. And so I use those examples of what not to do, but that shouldn't stop us from bringing our full faith-based selves into the public square. With immigrant justice, what I'm seeing a lot of now are people who are compelled by their faith. In fact, I'm on a Signal chat, where people are standing up to kind of just accompany people to their appointments because they're living in fear, just to be a presence with them. That's the kind, I think, of living out our faith and about what it means to welcome the stranger and to love our neighbor, that we can do in a very expressive way, and to make clear that we're there because it's a calling of our faith. And I think there's a really important role that the faith community can play in this moment of not just agreeing to what's going on when it's such rank injustice and violence that's going on in our midst. So I hope that helps. Thanks.
Thank you. And we have Jim.
I had a couple of things I wanted to say. One, I'd reinforce the Catherine Stewart book. I read that book and it blew my mind. All the money that's out there in the right-wing political, religious groups and what they're doing behind the scenes. And she does a remarkable job of exposing all of that. As a side thing, her husband, Matthew Stewart, also writes books on this topic. He's a philosopher. And so it's a different take on things. But if you're interested in getting some historical, philosophical, and a little theological stuff, Matthew Stewart, his book is An Emancipation of the Mind. So when I discovered they were a couple, I blew my mind too. You were talking, somebody brought up the topic of when the Pilgrims came, it was a very direct religious thing. My research and studies, I'm a retired Presbyterian minister, and I spent my career being a licensed marriage and family therapist. And about 10 years ago, I got into some genealogy stuff and discovered that my ancestors came to Jamestown in 1635. And I began to do a lot of study and research on that whole thing because they came and had indentured servants, and that proceeded to be 7 generations in my family of slave owning. It didn't end until the Emancipation Proclamation. And so I became very curious about everything that was going on back there. And even though I grew up in that area, I didn't know any of this until a few years ago. And my ancestors came to England from the Reformation times over in France and Germany. And when they wanted to come to America in the 1630s, in order to do so, they were Protestants, and they had to swear allegiance to the new Church of England at that time. So anybody who came had to be willing to declare allegiance to the church. Now, not being a professional historian and so on and so forth, I may have some of my information a little bit off, but my understanding is that, and reading all the things I have, that religion in Virginia in the 1600s wasn't very powerful. Even though you had to swear allegiance to the church, there were very few churches, especially very early. And so religion had very little to do. It was all tied up, however, with the politics. All of the aristocratic, wealthier people who owned the large properties and everything, which my family did not own a large property. But that you would see in the laws that they wrote, that they were parroting a lot of Church of England kind of religion in there, not so directly, but it was in there, and the influence was there. And so my take on the earliest development of racism in America and perpetual Black slavery, the invention of the white race occurred in Jamestown and in Virginia in the 1600s, where they moved from having Black people often free and equal to white people at the same station in life, to perpetual slavery by the end of the century. And the religious stuff is not dominant in that discourse, but it's behind the scenes. It's a fascinating and heartbreaking story when your ancestors participated in it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to share that.
Well, I appreciate it, Jim. And I will say, just to add on, I think your telling of that history shows how incredibly complicated history is, right? And so in a way that the mythology of a Christian nation is not. Myths are not complicated because they're not true. They're stories that are made up to try to explain things in a certain way that don't really reflect the complexity of humanity and of what was happening at the time. I know a little bit about Virginia because a couple of reasons. One, the organization I lead, BJC, we have for 10 years had a professional development and leadership development program where we bring people who are interested in religious freedom to colonial Williamsburg in Virginia and learn on site about how religious freedom was formed. And so through that work in Virginia, have learned things, just like you say, that the prevalence of the Church of England, it was much more of a political body in many ways than it was what we would think of as a modern church experience, because church attendance was compulsory. It was a place, that you would be fined if you didn't show up at church, because that's where you'd hear the community announcements. Of course, the tithes and the offerings which were really taxes, went to go support the church as well. So when you look at just like actual voluntary faith or religious observance or religious belief, historians have shown that in the colonial period, it was actually quite low. Because it was forced. It wasn't a freely chosen faith for most people. And that story replicates in modern times. And I cite some research in my book that says, that countries that have established religion actually have much lower levels of religion and religious observance than those that don't have established religion. And so yet another reason. The other piece of Virginia I'll add is that one of the examples that I sometimes give about how old Christian nationalism is from the colony of Virginia, the General Assembly there, which in 1667, again, to be a member of that assembly, you had to be a white Anglican man. So they were all, again, professing to have this Christian identity, but they passed a law that said a Christian baptism would not free a person of African American, Native American, or mixed race descent. So they quite literally sacrificed one of the core ideas and practices of Christianity, of baptism, to the altar of power, and said, no, we're actually going to subsume baptism under how the state defines human freedom.
When you look at other things like that, like a marriage, when they made laws before that you could not have a mixed marriage, and if you did, one person of that might even have the death penalty. And so those were while they played the religious game in establishing you got to be an Anglican to be in a legislature, they ignored. They made the laws to suit themselves, and that particular law was a way to help keep certain people, primarily blacks, from becoming free.
Mm-hmm. I just want to also note the comment from Lisa right in the chat that when you do see high levels of religious experience, it's often from both the enslaved community or from dissenting communities like Baptists, and sometimes those overlap. So one of the people that we learned from in colonial Williamsburg is someone who was an enslaved person named Gowan Pamphlet, who was believed to be the first ordained African-American, at least in Virginia, if not in the larger country. And he founded, after he was enslaved, and after he was deemed legally free, he founded the First Baptist Church of Williamsburg, which continues to be in operation today. So we have to understand, as I mentioned earlier, the actual religious history of the country is much more diverse and varied than what the official history is, because of who was thought to be full citizenship and fully human, frankly, at the time, by those who were pursuing these racist policies.
Amanda, I have a question for you, and we have time for maybe one more question. You preach a lot to congregations, and you do a lot of teaching with denominations. One of the things that we constantly hear in my office is a struggle of pastors who are sometimes intimidated. They're told that they cannot preach, that they are being partisan if they preach the gospel of Jesus in the way that many of us believe is the good news, the true good news. I'm wondering, what are some of your sermon titles when you preach?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I preach from the lectionary, so as I'm sure a lot of you do. So I don't have kind of, one particular sermon title. But I do, I guess I'll say I feel for you all. I know that it's difficult just to be a pastor is difficult, and then to pastor in our highly polarized times when we're coming under threat from so many different places. And I have the luxury of being a guest preacher, so I get to pop in and give a message and then pop right back out, so I don't abuse that. I try to understand the congregation that I'm talking to and not say anything that will create longer term problems for the people who are staying. But for those of you who do have churches, I would say, and you all know this, but there may be places that some of this can be started outside the pulpit, right? That there is a place certainly for prophetic preaching. And if your church needs a little more discipleship before maybe they're ready to receive that prophetic word, what does it look like to start having a smaller group conversation around these issues? I often get the opposite. I get questions from lay people who are like, I wish that my pastor would speak on this and they're not doing it. And then I say, well, you know what? You're a member of this church too. Again, I'm from the Baptist tradition. I am not ordained myself. I'm an active lifelong lay leader. And so I'm always like, come on, lay people, step up and do your part. Will you lead a Sunday school class where you can explore some of these issues? It doesn't all have to be in that particular mode. But I do emphasize there are many ways for those who do feel that it is, that they're feeling called to do some of this prophetic preaching to these issues. That we do so in ways that are strictly nonpartisan. And there are so many ways to do that. I didn't even get into today. There's this recent new effort to try to allow pulpit endorsements of political candidates, something that our organization very much opposes, because we feel, one, it's not something most pastors want to do, but fear the influence of partisan money coming in. So sticking to the gospel, preaching the gospel, doing so in ways that are relevant to what is going on around us, and just trusting that you know your congregation. So those would be my words on that.
I wonder if there's no more questions there's one question. Edgar, we'll take your question very quickly and then we'll ask Amanda for some closing remarks.
Hi, Amanda. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for this lecture. I think a major problem with the Christian church is that a lot of people don't know Christ. They don't know Jesus. And just like the disciples didn't really know Jesus, they were still wanting power and to be at his right and his left and the coming kingdom. And Jesus had to disavow their misunderstanding. And once they figured it out and they became apostles, how they lived out their following of the word. But after that, after the Roman Catholic Church took over the church, like there's a stark difference between the apostle early church and the Roman Catholic Church right after the fall of Rome. And I think that's where our Christian understanding comes from, is that power base, that power hungry base of wanting and taking, and it's so different from what Christ wanted us to know, how the God of love wanted us to be. So we have to dissolve ourselves with this power hungry settler colonialism and just take, mine mentality, to understand that God is not a God of scarcity, but a God of abundance. So we have to get back to understanding Scripture and knowing, who Jesus Christ is, and understanding what the Gospels are truly saying, if we're ever going to beat this. Because I think most folks don't know the Bible at all. They're just following what the person in front of them is saying.
A true word that I really agree with. And I think the way I phrased it earlier is just the sediment of power over many centuries has so corrupted how we understand Christianity, to the point we sometimes can't even recognize Jesus in it. One piece that I speak to often in my preaching, kind of to the prior question, is just how very countercultural Jesus was. Countercultural to the power of his time, both the power of the Roman Empire, but even the religious authorities of his time, that he was often out of step with both of them because of how he wanted to upset the worldly order. First shall be last, last shall be first, you know, all of these things. And we have so domesticated our understanding of Jesus that because for most of us, we aren't very countercultural, right? We have so fit into the culture of our times. And I think that's the real challenge. And that it does take, and, you know, I don't belittle the cost that this all will take for us, a cost of relationship, cost of status, cost of privilege. And the cost will be greater for some of us than others because of the dangers that our society poses. To people of color, to LGBTQ, to women in different situations, to immigrants, you know, all of these different groups that that we know. So I just I agree. I think that it's part of all of our calling as Christians, and those of you who lead Christian communities, to help our communities understand what truly following Jesus looks like, and to support one another in our faith.
We are at our time, and I wonder if you would just help me to thank Amanda for the webinar today, and whether we do some jazz hands or applaud, we could do that as well. We're very thankful for you being with us and for sharing with us. There are lots of questions about the recording of the presentation, and we certainly will make that available for future viewing. The book is available, and we encourage you to get Amanda's book. And Amanda, is there any type of study guide that goes along with your book?
Great question. So in the book itself, there are discussion questions after every chapter. And we are thinking about developing a more, a separate study guide, but basically everything you would need for individual group study is in the book itself.
Thank you. Thank you, good people of God. We are so glad to have you, and blessings on the remaining of your day. Bye-bye.